Thank you so much for joining Immigrant Defense Project and Witness today to talk about how communities and grassroots groups are fighting back against the expanding mass deportation system, how organizers are challenging mainstream narratives and documenting abuses by immigration. Before we get started, a few things. Please mute yourselves and make sure your cameras are off so there are no interruptions in your audio. We're recording this and we will share it after. We're presenting today in English and have a Spanish interpreter from Caracol Interpreters Co-op. If you want Spanish audio, please call the number included in the reminder email and that appears here on the slide. If you're having any technical issues, type questions into the chat box, or you can email feedback@witness.org, which appears in the middle of the slide. We will do a question and answer session with our presenters at the end. As you're listening, please type any questions you have into our chat box. You can type questions in Spanish as well. Finally, please share anything interesting you learn on social media using the hashtag #EyesOnIce. My name is Michelle Harris. I work at Immigrant Defense Project. At IDP, we fight for fundamental fairness for immigrants accused or convicted of crimes. We advocate against the systems of mass incarceration and mass deportation. We've been tracking, requesting information, and training community members on immigration raids and arrests for the past few years. My co-organizers are Polly Makam and Jackie Zamudo at Witness. Witness trains and supports people to use video safely, ethically, and effectively to expose human rights abuses and to fight for change. So we're in a really challenging moment for immigrants and immigrants' rights advocates in the United States. The federal government is trying to take the mass deportation system to a scale that we've never seen before. And we're starting to hear more and more stories exposing the cruelty and injustice of the system. People are often asking us about their rights to document raids. And if you haven't, check out part 1 of this series where we detailed what ICE is doing in communities, your right to film, and tips on sharing ethically and effectively. You can access a recording and slides at imdefense.org/eyesonice. Today is part 2, and we're really excited to have presenters from grassroots groups that have thought about documenting abuses in their communities and challenging mainstream narratives. I'm going to do a very brief recap, and then we'll have our first presenter. So first, it's important to know who's in our communities and who is disappearing people. When we talk about immigration raids in the community, it most often involves Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agents. ICE is the federal agency responsible for detaining and deporting immigrants. ICE is under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security, which replaced the INS after 9/11. In addition to ICE, there is Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, which inspects people at the borders and ports of entry, and there is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, which decides immigration applications. And both CBP and CIS send people to ICE for deportation. Within ICE, there are 2 main arms funneling people into the deportation system. Enforcement and removal operations, or ERO agents, are usually the ones arresting people in communities. However, Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, is another part of ICE that often works in joint task forces with police to arrest people in the community. They're often involved in cases where there are allegations of things like drug trafficking or gang activity. Arrests involving HSI are sometimes just for deportation, but also sometimes involve criminal charges. We're going to emphasize this over and over today, but it's important to remember that depending on where you are, there are a lot of things that feed people into the mass deportation system. So some common triggers are international travel, immigration applications, and arrests, that involve law enforcement sharing information with immigration. It's important to consider how to stop some of these pipelines in doing the work of challenging immigration raids. As you're thinking about plans for documenting ICE abuses, remember there are many places where ICE agents arrest people. So a really common place is at jails and prisons, people being released from criminal custody. They arrest people in public, stopping them in cars or on the street, or going to courthouses, including both criminal court and family court. And they go to people's homes, where they sometimes use force, intimidation, or lies to get into houses and arrest unsuspecting people for deportation proceedings. For more information on the bad and harmful tactics ICE agents use, I suggest reading IDP's toolkit created with the Center for Constitutional Rights, or our booklet, which lays out the different ways ICE has been carrying out raids and your rights during encounters with ICE. You can also watch part 1 of this webinar for more information. So let's talk briefly about documentation. It is legal to film law enforcement and immigration in public and in your home as long as you don't interfere. Make sure you film visibly, as some states have laws against secret recording. And you should comply with orders like back up, or you could face arrest. It's important to remember safety. So ICE agents care more about their safety than yours. So be careful when reaching for anything like a phone, and consider the risks as well as whether there are other ways to document what is happening. We'll talk more today about the various ways to document abuses besides filming, but we urge you to consider having multiple strategies and developing protocols within your organizations for training about each and sharing the results. It's also important to consider what you do with documentation, particularly things like footage from a phone. Consider protocols for sharing ethically so you don't expose others or yourself to retaliation or harm. For more information on your right to film ICE and practical tips on sharing ethically, read Witnesses Filming ICE tip sheet in English and Spanish. Also, again, watch part 1 of this webinar where we talked more in detail about the power and the perils of filming. Witness also posted answers on their blog to questions that we got during the last webinar, so check that out at Witness's website. So today, we're really grateful to have community organizers talk about their approaches and how they've incorporated documentation into their work. First up, we welcome Yaritza Mendez, the citywide outreach coordinator at Make the Road New York, which uses a model of multi-issue, multi-generational organizing, transformative education, and survival services to build the power of Latino and working class communities. Yaritza will talk about how their organizers have set up systems to respond to panic among members about ICE, verify raids reports, and document actual raids. I'd just like to remind all of our presenters to please speak slowly for the interpreters, and I'm going to transfer it over to you now, Yaritza.
Thank you. So post-election, we at Make the Road, we created what we call Comité de Defensas, or defense committees, with the hope to educate, prepare, and organize families in all or most communities in New York City. The idea for each of the committee organizers that we have at Make the Road was to train between 5 to 10 community members that they have in their committee meetings, who will then replicate the information on KYR to community leaders or institutions in their individual communities, and to do so that way. The idea that we had envisioned, in case that one of those, if the raid were to happen in a specific community, was for the community leader to reach out to a Make the Road community organizer or community organizer, so that then he or she could reach out to the lead organizers and Make the Road, who will then put that person into contact with one of our lawyers. So it was kind of like a tree of communication with multiple layers into it. We thought about a lot in terms of like technology and whether it was feasible to use WhatsApp. And because we deal and we interact with folks with, you know, different ages and that are either comfortable using technology or are uncomfortable using technology, so we also had to take that into consideration. For a lot of the folks, the WhatsApp was something that they felt more comfortable using, and so we decided to go down that route. One of the challenges that we experienced as we tried to put together the Comités de Defensa was that we noticed that it was easier for it to work in Staten Island and Long Island, given that community organizers were already working in TERFs, compared to here in the city, where community organizers had folks coming in from living in different part of different part of Queens. So, for instance, our immigration committee could have folks ranging living in either Corona or East Elmhurst, Sunnyside, and so on and so forth. So it was really hard to just tell an organizer, you have to just focus on the area of Corona and just kind of like avoid or exclude the folks that are still part of their committees but are living elsewhere. And the other thing that we kind of like notice is that we cannot do this alone, right? We have this great idea, and I think that if we do so with other organizations throughout, and I'm just choosing the example of Queens because that's where I'm mostly based off at. If we use other community-based organizations in Queens that could support us, right, in making sure that the Comités de Defensa is off the ground, that each of those folks replicate in this KY materials in their individual communities, it will make a lot more sense. In terms of like the systems that we've created for the Know Your Rights workshops. So our Know Your Rights workshops cover how ICE identifies people at risk of deportation, the tactics of arrest implemented or used under Bush's and Obama's administration, the KYR in terms of like at street and at home, and also giving folks tips on how to report and record. The warrants, you know, what is admissible and what is not. A role play just to make sure that folks are leaving away with a clear understanding of what they should do in case they do interact with ICE. And lastly, with family planning and kind of like giving them the opportunity to join our designator of tour clinics that we have here at Make the Road. And the way that we kind of like keep track of the requests that were coming in post-election was by creating a Google form, which is bilingual, right, to get all the information that we needed, from the name of institution to location and more or less a tentative date that they would like us to come in and do the workshop. We were able to train folks at health institutions, at schools and daycares, at senior centers, religious institutions, and CBOs, and so on and so forth. We've also been able to share our information or materials with folks within New York City, but also outside of New York City, who felt comfortable in facilitating the material if they just have if they can take a look at our agenda and PowerPoint. And so the clinic for the families, we created it with the idea of providing families with a package deal, not only providing them with information that they could get from the KYR, but also for them to think about family planning, right, and what that entailed. And so with the clinic, we were able to find volunteer lawyers to come into the office, both in Queens and in Brooklyn, and also we tried to do the same thing for Staten Island and Long Island, with the idea of helping families create or fill out the designator of tutorship. And, you know, the folks were able to walk away with the form notarized. It was totally free of charge, and with a clear understanding of how the form worked, and, you know, when it expired and when they had to renew. When we did the KYR, or when we do the KYR, we also give out what we call the defense manual, which has information about family preparedness, and it has a checklist for document collection, and also it provides folks with space for them to write important information, like the name of the school of their kids, the doctor, you know, the worker and the phone number of the worker, and where they kind of like saved all this necessary information. And we also told them that they have to make sure that every member of the household knew about this form and where all these documents were kept at. In the manual, we also have information, or a one-pager on KYR put together by Make the Road, by IDP, and also kind of like information on in terms of like health, and how does health agencies take care or protect the information of their clients. And then I'm going to move on now into talking about the rapid response in terms when it comes to raids, and how our legal and organizing department have been working together post-election. So one of the ways that we try to make sure that we are informed about all the raids that are coming through Make the Road was by creating an email group, and we call it redadas, or raids. And so anyone that Make the Road that gets a raid will send us an email automatically, saying, you know, this is the information that you need to know about this particular raid, and, you know, this is where this person is held at, whether or not the family member was given information about legal representation or referrals that we know about. And Make the Road, I usually, when I hear of cases, I make sure that I know the A number, that I filled out the IDP survey, that I find out whether or not the person qualifies for NYFAP or the New York Immigrant Family Unit Project. And if not, then I make sure that folks are walking away with referrals, right? One thing that I do want to kind of like to talk about before I end, right, is that we were able, because the reporting and recording is important, we actually were able to, one of the cases that came through Make the Road, a sister of someone who was detained was able to take a picture of the ICE agent, of one of the ICE agents that went to the home to arrest the brother. And in the picture, we were able to see the uniform that the agent had, which clearly said in the front of the vest police, and in the back of the vest it said ICE, which is totally misleading, right? And she didn't know who they were before opening the door. She had sent us that picture, and we were able to share with IDP, but we then were hesitant to share it with other allies because of the way that the picture was taken and the information that the picture has, right, about the location and not in this other stuff. And lastly, the Make the Road has put together, because of the collaboration between the organizing and legal, we were able to put together the defense, a deportation defense manual, which will be printed and published soon, and has information about know your rights, rapid raid response, and kind of like what to do and what not to do. And lastly, deportation defense when it comes to organizing campaigns and how to help families stop the deportation of their loved one. That's all I have from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yaritza. We're next going to move to hearing from David Aboud, an organizer at the National Day Labor Organizing Network, or NDLON. NDLON works to develop leadership, mobilize and organize day laborers in order to protect and expand their civil, labor, and human rights. David is based in Los Angeles, California, where he empowers members to advocate for universal representation in immigration court, against collaboration between ICE and local police, and against ICE's attempts to normalize raids in the community. Today, David is going to talk about a particular raid video he worked on and about the state of individual campaigns to stop deportations given the current political climate.
Sorry. Hi everyone. So can everyone see me okay? I'm gonna take that as a yes. Okay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about a video that was used for a campaign to stop the deportation of Romulo Abelica, who is a father in a neighborhood here in Los Angeles in Highland Park, who was picked up after dropping off his I think 11-year-old daughter at school, and who was then picked up by ICE a couple blocks away from the school with his other young daughter in the car. So we're going to play that video now. Just before that video is played, it's about 20. We're only going to play about 25 seconds of it. If people want to see more of it, you can look it up online. It's Romulo Abelica. If you put it on YouTube, you could find it easily. But just a warning that it is a video that might be triggering, especially for folks who might have gone through experiences like that. So just a warning, it'll be probably about 30 seconds. So I'm not sure if people heard the audio on that video, but the audio, I think, is the part that makes that video particularly compelling. The audio is of Fatima, Romulo's 12-year-old daughter, sobbing very audibly. And it's a video that every time that I watch it makes me cry. And I think that, so I want to go a little bit over kind of like what were the steps in which deciding to release that video. When we first saw that video, it was after we had already begun mobilizing to stop Romulo's deportation. And we were meeting with the media and with the family. And when we first saw the video, we didn't hear the audio very clearly. So we also saw that the police were being pretty reasonable with the Abelicas, that ICE was being pretty reasonable with the Abelicas, that they did have police jackets on and not jackets that would identify them as ICE. So for us first, we thought that, okay, maybe this is something that we don't want to share that might not be super helpful in this case. It eventually did get out to the media. It was decided by the family and the principal of the school that this was something that they were going to be releasing. And when it was released, the video went viral instantly, and it had over 500,000 views on YouTube within a couple days. There were national and international media that was covering this story all of a sudden. And that, for at least for me and for my fellow organizer-attorney who was working on that case, we were taken a little bit by surprise because it was so. Because it went so viral. We weren't expecting that quite yet. So I think that for people that did see it, and the reason that it became very viral is because it's a video that does quite a lot of work in terms of making the case for why people should care about what's going on, and why people should care in particular about this case, and getting people on the side of the Abelicas and on our side. So it's in particular because the video is taken from inside the car, and you see, so you were almost forced to take the point of view of Fatima, Romulo's 12-year-old daughter, and it really shows quite visibly and clearly the devastation and the trauma that is caused by incarceration and deportation, right? And seeing that happen to you in your very right in front of your eyes, and it was very clear for exposing the kind of violence that is happening in this country to people every day. It also exposed the egregious actions that ICE is taking, and the way that ICE is becoming much more brazen with their tactics, right? Picking up someone two or three blocks away from a school is really shocking and in flagrant violation of their own policy. So we were able to make, you know, a variety of arguments that came from that video. I think in particular, when you think about what those, whether you're going to be releasing a video or not, there's a few steps and I think a few questions that you have to ask yourself. So first is the sensitivity and safety of the video, right? In particular, when you're releasing videos documenting ICE and CBP, they are videos where you might not know what the status is of everyone in that video, right? So you want to be very sure that when you are doing that video that you know the status of the people that are in it, that those people are comfortable with that and okay with it, and that they're not then going to be targeted for it. So Fatima is a citizen, so she was able to share that video and then to speak about it, as were her other sisters. So that's kind of like the first part, right? When we think about sharing a video publicly. So who is being portrayed? What's their immigration status, or what are other vulnerabilities? And is it safe? And will they face retaliation? And if they do face retaliation, are you and they prepared to act around that? The second is the impact, right? How will it help or not help the case that you're trying to make? Be aware that when you are putting out a video into the media, there is a loss of control that happens with the narrative. There's also, in some ways, a gaining of that control, right? If the only narrative that you have is CBP or ICE saying certain things and spreading lies about the people that are in the video, that's a way in which you can regain control. But once it's out there, it's very hard for you to actually dictate where that's going to go and how people are going to take that. In this case, there were a lot of emotion. The emotional impact was really big. The audience really cared about it, and there was quite, and we were exposing the actions of ICE, and also the personal thing that is the personal reaction to and feelings and trauma that's caused by it. And just the last thing that I want to touch on really briefly is that when you're doing deportation defense, you have to be really careful about whether you want a campaign to be public or whether you want it to be something that's more private. In the past, public campaigns were really good for shaming the Obama administration, which clearly doesn't work with the Trump administration, right? So private campaigns now we're starting to see that as being something that's more effective, taking people into sanctuary, accompanying them to court, and then also being willing and able to respond when something does happen, or if they start being actually deported. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, David, and I apologize for the technological issues that we didn't get the audio on there. We will send out the link later so people who want to watch the video can. So next up, we have Imani Henry, who founded Equality for Flatbush, a people of color-led multinational grassroots organization that does anti-police repression, affordable housing, and anti-gentrification organizing in Flatbush, Brooklyn, New York. Imani will talk about the importance of rapid response networks being responsive to and documenting the various government enforcement systems, including ICE, that police, impact, and displace immigrants. I'm now going to set up the camera so we can see Imani.
Hello. So thank you for having me. I want to speak mostly as a group that is not necessarily a migrants' rights group doing grassroots organizing. College for Flatbush was founded in 2013 specifically in the uptick of tenant harassment and police violence that was happening, specifically murders in the Flatbush East Flatbush neighborhood. We lost 2 black women and 1 young black male to police murder between 2012 and 2013. And one of the things that I think is important in the work that we're doing is that we are the police accountability group for our neighborhood. We are the cop watch team for our neighborhood. And we've worked alongside various migrant rights groups in our community. So just a quick overview of Flatbush. Flatbush is the largest enclave of Caribbean people outside of the Caribbean in New York City. It is highly long-time migrant folks from the Caribbean, as well as folks that have recently come to the U.S., as well as being incredibly Latinx folks, South Asian folks, Muslim and Arab folks. And so we are a community of migrants in many ways, shape, or forms. With that said, we've always had a high level of police violence in the community. We also have one of the highest stocks of affordable housing in New York City. In 2014, we had over 33,000 units of rent-stabilized housing. With this said, we have so many various forces of law enforcement that occupy our community. So on top of the NYPD and the various precincts, we also have like the Strategic Response Group that actually patrols Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Manhattan that are now patrolling East Flatbush. We know that at this point in time in our neighborhood, we talked about checkpoints and traffic stops. We've been able to document that when the police are out in force, every 15 minutes or less, there's a traffic stop happening in Flatbush, East Flatbush. And in particularly, I think it's also important that when we really talk about the impact of police violence, we know how many people are also murdered by the police by traffic stops and checkpoints in our community. And that's something that's one of our main pieces of stop displacement and police murder in Brooklyn, New York. So with this said, I wanted to also talk about, because the essence for us is partnering with migrant rights groups as like the community cop watch team and the anti-gentrification, community organizers. And so some of the things that we've, tried to document and also like work in collaboration with the migrant groups in our community is one, looking at all the various other ways that folks become vulnerable to deportation in our community. So for instance, we have folks that are street vendors in our community. Folks are getting, at this point in time, due to gentrification, there are ordinances on the books that say that street vendors cannot be on Flatbush Avenue, which is the longest street in all of Brooklyn, between the hours of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., Monday through Saturday, which makes that folks cannot work, basically, right? And we're busy fighting the bid on that. But in our community right now, folks are getting $2,000 tickets for vending in our neighborhood. And that is like, in general. We know that that's coming from, one, the Department of Health. We know that that's also coming from the NYPD. We've actually been able to document and prove that the NYPD is walking around with tickets that are specifically going to the Department of Health, going to a whole separate, unit that folks will then pay that ticket versus criminal court. We've been able to document the dollar van drivers, which are largely Haitian immigrants in our community that are also, not only driving dollar vans, but also, really frankly, are the owners of the fleets of dollar vans. These are black small dog businesses in our neighborhood, also getting $2,000 tickets. And then we look at the Taxi and Limo Commission that are jumping out with the NYPD to then hand out these tickets to dollar van and dollar cab drivers in our neighborhood. Then the other piece of it, and then going back to tenants in our community, we have had whole struggles to fight, particularly this is again Haitian, we want to be really clear. In our neighborhood, when there was a recent uptick in February, we were able to really survey and look at where ICE raids were happening in our neighborhood, was specifically in East Flatbush to Haitian families. And we can talk about like multiple raids that have happened over the course of the last few years, for specifically targeting Haitian families. But particularly, one of the things that we found is landlords calling ACS, which is child welfare, on Haitian families that are organizing tenant associations. And so again, one of the things we were able to do was actually go after this particular landlord and then report them to child welfare as you know, creating these fraudulent accounts against Haitian folks. And with this said, I think the most important thing for us is really looking at all the various ways that our folks then become court involved. We know that there are Haitian families in our community that have actually given up their housing because landlords have pointed surveillance cameras to their front doors. It's a huge thing that's going on across New York where landlords say, I know that someone went into your house that sold drugs. This is actually true. This is what was said to a Haitian family. I know someone went into the house that sells drugs. They're not on the lease, but we know we have video that says they did that. Family is ready to give up their apartment because they're afraid of being court involved. And so we fight these landlords to stop this, you know, to these fraudulent ways of their reporting folks to make them court involved. So again, people then are afraid of whether or not they will then be investigated from child welfare, that they'll be investigated by, you know, I guess I want to just also say, like, if, you know, any kind of ticket, any kind of summons that you have, if you're unable to pay this, then, you know, if you miss a court date, there's a warrant for your arrest. There's so many various ways that in our community, people end up court involved, and something as small as jumping a turnstile, something as small as an open container, or having a parking ticket, or not paying, you know, one of your summonses, have people then involved and having ICE at their door. And this has been something that we've been organizing with migrant rights organizations in our neighborhood to document and fight. But I think the most important thing I'll just wrap up with is that we have then partnered with our migrant rights groups in our neighborhood to then, one, we're working on a rapid response, you know, as a Cop Watch team, and especially during the uptick that happened, of really looking at how do we create better systems to get to people to investigate and document. We have also created a whole bunch of handouts in different languages. We already roll in 3 different languages, which is Creole, Haitian Creole, Spanish, and English. That's all of our literature is in those 3 languages. But making sure things are in Bangla, making sure that things are in Urdu, you know, and in some cases, sometimes in Korean and Chinese for the various folks in our neighborhood, and making sure those things get out. But then lastly, I will also say that I think is, and the other piece of this is also really being very clear, particularly in gentrifying neighborhoods, of also making sure that new residents, particularly white residents, are also being part and parcel brought in in ways that they know you must defend immigrant communities and all the ways that you can do that. And so that we've, you know, figuring out whatever that might be. Do you have extra spaces in your home? Do you have a car? What can you do to help and support immigrant communities in this defense of themselves against ICE, against NYPD, and all the other law enforcement that are trying to deport and displace our people?
Thank you so much, Imani. So now we're actually thankful to have Ben Ndugga-Kabuye from BAJI, who's actually here in the same place as Imani, so they're just going to switch places. Ben is BAJI's Research and Policy Associate, where he analyzes, investigates, and interprets policies, programs, and issues that impact Black families and communities across the diaspora. So today he's going to talk about a statewide campaign that reflects a holistic approach to immigrants' rights work, particularly how the criminal, legal, and immigration systems intersect. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Michelle, thank you for having me, and thank you for all of you who spending this Tuesday night with us. We want to talk about today about the intersection between the immigration system and the criminal justice system, and really kind of honing on the idea of mass criminalization, because we think this is really important, because we need to understand how the systems that bear down on immigrant communities are at every level of where immigrants live and surround our communities in cages of policy and law. And so I think what is useful for people to kind of think about this is to understand that the criminal justice system is the welcome mat into immigration enforcement. And this is true from the founding of kind of the last pieces of the immigration enforcement system. And so just to take you all back to the 90s, We have the kind of now famous crime bills in 92, 94, 96, which gave us 3-strike legislation and a number of kind of really egregious pieces of our criminal justice system. But what a lot of people forget is that these were also immigration bills, and then what these things did was that they, for example, added 50 new categories of mandatory deportable felonies when before there were only about 4 or 5. And then on top of that, they made these offenses retroactive, so that if you, for instance, were arrested for a DUI in 85, and then 96 that becomes under immigration law a felony, you can then be deported after you've served time or went to jail or came out of the criminal justice system. And so basically what the immigration enforcement system is that it takes kind of the worst aspects of the criminal justice system and intensifies them. And whether that means indefinite detention or even removing the right to an attorney, a right to representation in court. So this is how these systems work on a legislatively in law and how they bear down on communities. But we also see that kind of in this has been the trend for the last 5 decades since from the civil rights movement forward. But and kind of reflecting on those last 5 decades, we see that this current administration is not a departure of from the past, but more of an intensification of what has always been a current trend. And this is kind of most famously in the executive orders that many of us are discussing, the recent travel ban. But these orders, what in many ways they did was to say, we're going to not only expand who is criminal, but put massive resources into deportation and detention, while, of course, to fund that national deportation machine, cutting the basic resources that make communities livable, which is housing, education, and healthcare. And so on the local ground where people live, this national trend federally and historically is also happening in local communities. And for example, one example being here in New York City, a city that kind of brands itself as an immigrant city. What we saw even starting back before this new federal presidential administration, in 2014, there was a decision to expand the NYPD and add 1,300 new police officers. We had a cost of which could be around $200 million a year, and potentially in 10 to 15 years could become a $5 or $6 billion investment in expanding the NYPD, which is the largest police force in the country, and also implement what is termed broken windows policing. And this expansion of the NYPD was corresponded with a cut in housing and education and healthcare. And this is in a city that is in many ways the largest immigrant cities in the country. So what broken windows policing did was to focus police arrest and ticketing for low-level offenses. Now, why this is important is that for immigrants, any contact with the criminal justice system leaves them vulnerable to detention and deportation. So since 2014, the #1 arrest category in New York City has been fare beating. So for those of you who are not in New York, what that means is that when you jump, New York City has a subway system. So when you're unable to pay the fare, if you jump the turnstile or jump the gate to get into the train anyway, to be able to get to work, get to home, get to school, or what you need to do, that arrest for $2.75, when you don't have a ticket to get in, that arrest category is the #1 arrest category in New York City. And so 30,000 people a year get arrested for that. 92% of those people of color, the overwhelming majority of them who are young people. And what's important for immigration, while this is only a misdemeanor in our state code, in immigration laws, this can be a mandatory deportable felony. And so this is a deportable offense. And like so many of the broken windows policing infrastructure, and in localities from Atlanta to Oakland and across the country, these kind of low-level interactions are kind of the main ways that immigrants are put into the immigration system. And so in New York City, there was the launch of a campaign called Swipe It Forward in partnership with a number of organizations like the Coalition and Broken Windows, Equality for Flatbush, that Imani heads up, and across the city, an effort to say that we need to stop broken windows policing, but also create communities of support where people swipe each other in and let each other into into the trains, not only because we understand that broken windows policing is an attack on our communities, but immigrants are our neighbors, and people should not be deported at all, let alone for a $2.75 fare. And so what we need to see is that immigration isn't a system that sits on a hill away from all the other systems of surveillance and policing, but it's part and parcel of the fabric of our society, and is foundational to kind of the criminal justice system that we see, and the racial profile that we see in the criminal justice system really intersects and overlaps into the immigration enforcement system. And so in our recent State of Black Immigrants report, we saw that not only, just like in the criminal justice system, in the immigration enforcement system, Black immigrants have the highest levels of detention, criminal alien detention, and criminal alien deportation. And so these are the consequences of an immigration system rooted in kind of systemic racism, and kind of the focus on understanding how ICE operates in our communities. We have to see that ICE is an agency that is working collaboratively with local law enforcement, and this effort of expanding the budgets of local enforcement of ICE, where this administration is planning on adding 10,000 new ICE agents, 5,000 new Border Patrol. This is going to reflect in local law enforcement, where there's going to be hyper intense collaboration between local law enforcement and the federal government, and also expanded budgets of local enforcement, so that people who are highly policed will also be highly deported, people who are highly surveilled will also be highly detained. So for those folks, for those of us who are prepared and kind of committed to defending immigrant communities, whether we're using our cameras, whether we're using cop watch methodology, we need to understand that these systems are not separate and not isolated, but are part of an infrastructure of a national deportation machine that is as local as much as it is federal.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. We really appreciate it. So here we would normally have question and answers. We're trying to keep this to an hour. So if you want to type in any questions that you have into the chat box, we can see if we can answer any of them. However, you can also submit questions to us after the fact, and we'll try to make sure to answer any of your questions or connect you to the organizers who you heard today. So here's the contact information to actually reach out to us with any questions. We also have linked to resources. My apologies. Okay, we've linked to resources here, including ways to support the campaigns that presenters talked about. We really hope that in your work, you all will consider ways to document the harms that ICE is inflicting on our communities, and really establish protocols for ethical and effective sharing of information. We encourage coalitions to continue building networks and learn from each other, just like Imani spoke about, just like Ben spoke about. And we'd love to hear from you all about any cases that you've tackled, where you've tackled documentation or any other challenges. And please feel free to email us directly or tweet with the hashtag #EyesOnIce. We have a couple more resources linked, and we'll send out the PDF. These are Equality for Flatbush's flyers on how to document police ICE harassment that are available in multiple languages. We have additional information on Equality for Flatbush and joining some of the efforts that they're engaging in. We also have information here on supporting Swipe It Forward, the campaign that Ben just mentioned. Thank you so much. We'd love to keep this conversation going, and we hope you will join us again in the future.